Recording in progress. He has been working diligently with respect to the vaccine. I asked him, I think it was a week ago, I asked him if he'd taken a day off, and he said, well, I got a day off a week or two ago, something like that. But it's been pretty much all day, every day for months now for him. So the reason this came about was probably a week and a half ago. Patrick and I were talking at small group one night, and Patrick said, Mike, if you've got anybody who's got questions about the vaccine, I'm glad to answer those. I'd love to be available to people. And so I tucked that away. And the next day I thought, well, wait a minute, why don't we make it available to anybody who's, considering the vaccine, that sort of thing, and needs someone to ask questions that knows what they're talking about. And so I asked Patrick if he'd mind doing a Zoom call like this, and he said he was up for it. So hopefully he doesn't hurt me after tonight. But anyway, so that's how we kind of arrived at this. Let me mention just a couple of things up front. So we, no bones about it. Patrick, and again, I don't have the medical expertise. That's Patrick's domain, but both of us are convinced about the efficacy of the vaccine. And I'm vaccinated. My whole family is vaccinated. I've got teenage kids. They're vaccinated. And so we've not had any issues with it at all. Our side effects were minimal. My son and I had no side effects when we got the vaccine. My wife and two daughters felt achy for about 12 hours, and that was it. So what we're going to do is Patrick's going to share for a few minutes up front, just kind of some basic things about the vaccine from his perspective. Try and sort of anticipate some of the questions you might have. He's here. Obviously, he's been working on vaccine distribution since March or February, Patrick? Is that right?
December.
There you go. So it's been quite a long time. And so he's heard probably all the questions that can be asked. And so he's going to try and anticipate a few of those, answer a few of those from his perspective. We're going to ask everybody to kind of limit at the beginning to one question because there's 12 of us on right now, and there's 35 or so registered total. So we're anticipating more folks jumping in. So we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to ask their questions. And if you've got a question in a minute, when we open it up to questions, if you're familiar with Zoom, which I'd guess at this point, pretty much all of us are familiar with Zoom, you'll see that at the bottom of your little Zoom screen, there's a thing that says reactions. If you will click on that, there's where you can raise your hand. And if you do that, that way we'll know that you have a question when it comes time for that. And then we'll call on you one at a time to ask your question, and Patrick will do his best to answer those questions. So with that said, Patrick, why don't you go ahead and begin and just kind of provide some explanation, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Sure. Thanks, Micah. So I'll just start with this. I've been doing this, like Micah said, for several months now. We do community clinics, and a lot of that time has just been engaging with people, answering questions. And believe me, I totally understand that this can be a very polarizing topic. And I know the opinions are, sharp in both directions, and I respect that 100%. So really my intention tonight is not to preach to you or try to convince you of one thing or the other. It's really just to answer some questions, hopefully give you some peace about questions you may have. And, and if there's things I don't know, I'll be honest with you and tell you I don't know. So I think, Micah, we talked last night, so I think probably just start with, where do we come down on why we feel this is important? And I'll just say that for me, I think I try to look at the evidence and see what does the data suggest. So really, if you look at like a risk-benefit type of equation. So if you think about these medications, we've now had 8 months of experience with, I might want to talk about here at the beginning about Pfizer and Moderna, since that's most of what our data is about, but looking at how long those drugs have been out and where they came from. So I think I like to start usually with saying that I know one of the biggest questions, and I think it's a very fair question to ask, is it seems like this was rushed. This happened quickly. How is it just last February, COVID entered our world, and then by December, we had vaccinations. And that's a very fair question. I think it's a good place to start because that oftentimes I think, can set the stage for why we believe that data or why we have questions around it. So I'll start with that. So basically, yes, it did happen quickly, but there's reasons for that. So I think if you look at the one positive thing from the pandemic is I think we had world collaboration and we had collaboration among drug companies, which normally doesn't exist. Typically, I think we are trying most of all to try to get to the market first and make the most money as a drug company. Well, in this situation, we had, multiple manufacturers and companies and governments coming together to identify how do we target this thing. So early on, we worked together they discovered quickly that this spike protein was likely the target if we were going to develop a vaccine. So early on, it became identified, which really allowed development to start pretty quickly. One of the biggest challenges in clinical trials usually is recruiting patients, because it could take months, years to recruit the number of patients that you need. Again, due to the health crisis, the demand for participating in those trials was unheard of. So they were able to enroll over 40,000 people in a matter of months into clinical trials. Just thinking about the Pfizer vaccine alone, so 44,000, I think, in that trial. So enrollment was very quick. So you could get a bunch of patients enrolled in these studies as early as last July to start begin testing vaccines. So one thing I think is important to note is that the study process is the same. So whether you take a drug for blood pressure or hypercholesterolemia, whatever that may be, the standard for bringing the drug to the market wasn't sacrificed. So the same safety and efficacy standards that brought this drug to the market in December are the same ones that hold true for anything else that you take. The difference is, you may have heard this term emergency use authorization, or EUA as we call it. And basically what that is, it's a first in our lifetime. We've had a situation where we had to use this mechanism to get not just drugs, but medical devices, lab tests, because we didn't even have lab tests to detect COVID at that time. So an EUA is basically a means in which the FDA can grant expedited approval to what they call countermeasures to the public health crisis. It just happened to be that that's the pathway these vaccines took as well. Much like the medicines that we use to treat patients admitted to the ICU, the hospital with COVID, many of those drugs also are under emergency use authorization because they haven't been out long enough to get full FDA approval. So the difference between this EUA for these vaccines and a full approval is really just time. So again, we know when these drugs got approved in December to be used in folks around the country, the safety, the efficacy data was there. So we know those drugs were effective at that point in time. So that was not sacrificed at all. But one piece that was not normal for a normal FDA approval was just the length of time in which we were able to evaluate the safety. So to get an EUA approval, it required 2 months of safety data. So at that point, we had 2 months of safety data, and we had over 20,000 people that had received that vaccine. So at that point, we knew that the vaccine was effective from what we knew in December, and we knew that at least the 2 months out, we didn't see any issues related to safety issues. And 2 months is important because typically with vaccines, if you're going to have an adverse reaction, it typically happens within the first 6 weeks. And we can talk later about, if you look at the things that have been uncovered since the drugs came to the market, the issues we've found for the Pfizer, Moderna, or the J&J have happened pretty quickly. So it's been within that 6 week window. So that 2 month window wasn't an arbitrary number. So I think by December, we knew that the efficacy looks great in these drugs and these vaccines, and the safety looks solid as well. And now looking fast forward where we are today, we're 8 months since we first started putting shots in arms. And now we have even more evidence that shows, yes, we still feel strongly about how well these vaccines work. Of course, the variant situation is different than it was in December, and that's created some complications and it throws some things to consider into the equation. But still, we know that we're looking today back to December that we're still preventing hospitalization prevention, death prevention from these vaccines is still holding strong, much like it was even back in December. We can talk about boosters and everything else later if you guys have questions, but just looking at where we know for how effective the vaccine was in December, we still are holding strong, preventing hospitalization and death, which is really what we're trying to shoot for here, is to keep folks out of the hospital. Even if you do get COVID as a breakthrough infection, your symptoms are milder, and you're not having profound side effects yet. So for me, looking at that risk-benefit equation is knowing what we know about the benefits of the vaccine and the risk of the vaccine, comparing that to what we know about COVID. And we still don't know a lot about long-term effects of COVID, but we certainly know that it could be devastating in the short term, and even fatal, of course, unfortunately. So it's that risk versus benefit equation. I think each person on the call, you have to make that determination for yourself, but I think it's important to at least start with where the drug came from, so we understand, A, does it feel rushed? Yeah, it does, but really, B, it was rushed in the sense that things happened in a more progressive manner than we typically see. And one thing I neglected to mention was typically when drugs are evaluated and studied, they don't typically start making those drugs in mass production until you know pretty certain that those drugs are going to work. Otherwise, you've got billions of dollars in investment at stake. Well, that's one thing where the government came in and they helped subsidize some of that and offset some of that expense so that if it didn't work, the companies weren't holding back for that. So all those things together really did make for an unprecedented situation that hopefully none of us ever have to experience again. But that's really, I think, the core basis of kind of where I fall on the vaccine. There's a whole lot to unpack there. I'm sure there's questions I have, so I don't want to dominate the entire conversation. So that's, I guess, for starters, Micah, we throw that out there and see if anybody has any questions, or we can expand some of that.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So Patrick's helped us kind of understand maybe the big first question, which is the speed that the vaccine came to market, and also helped answer a little bit about long-term side effects. Jeff McGee, Jeff's got a question. So Jeff, why don't you go ahead? You'll have to unmute yourself and then you'll be able to ask your question.
All right. Hey, thanks for taking my question and hosting this. So I like the way you framed it from a risk versus reward perspective. So I'm thinking, the vaccine is proven not to be risky in the first year, but what about 3 to 5 years from now? Yep. And what about a 15-year-old girl or 20-year-old girl, and 3 to 5 years from now we find out the long-term issue we didn't anticipate. Could you address that?
Sure, that's a great question, Jeff. That's one I probably should even address from the beginning. So, of course, we don't know long-term effects. So, it's impossible to say there's no long-term effects. So, I wouldn't ever want to say that whatsoever. I think like I said, what we do know with most vaccines, that if we have issues, let's just look for example, on the Pfizer and Moderna. We know that both of those vaccines, probably 3 months post-release, we had some issues reported with myocarditis, pericarditis, which were identified. So those happen in those situations generally in that first 2 month period. Likewise with J&J, issues we know around that blood clotting issue also happened within the first 6 weeks. So typically speaking, that does happen in the first 2 months, but it absolutely cannot be ruled out that there's no long-term effects. Again, to me personally, I just still weigh the risk versus benefit long-term there. And another good point you had there is about the infertility, I think is where you're going with the...
Months ago, I do not believe it was the Delta variant, but I was wondering, if you have COVID, do you recommend a particular vaccine? And I've seen some studies that have said if you have had COVID, you only need a single dose of the vaccine. You don't need the second dose. And I was wondering how long my antibodies would last, if I would need a booster and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. That's one that's asked a lot. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you. So my answer for you would be, I would still recommend being vaccinated. What we don't know is the risk of reinfection post-COVID. So there was a paper that was released last week. It wasn't without its flaws. It basically looked at people that had previous COVID infection that were vaccinated, and those that had previous COVID infection and who were not vaccinated. This paper found about a 2.3 higher incidence of redeveloping COVID in the group that was not vaccinated post-COVID infection. There's not a whole lot of data, though, that really shows, is that just a one dose? Do you need 2 doses? I would still say yes on the vaccine for you. We've had people, of course, that have had the vaccine that have still gotten COVID, particularly their infection is much lower. And likewise, we've had those that have had previous COVID infection that have developed COVID. So just my opinion of what we know, there's still a recommendation from the CDC still to get vaccinated despite having a previous COVID infection. As far as vaccine choice goes, it's a bigger discussion. I would say in general, if you're contemplating vaccine, I think what we know a lot more about mRNA vaccines, being Pfizer, Moderna. So I think those, we know the durability of those vaccines. J&J is a bit more of an unknown. There's been 350 million doses of COVID vaccine across the country. Only about 14 million of that was J&J. So we just don't know as much about J&J. J&J is great, though, for certain people who are unlikely to return for a second dose. Certainly 1 dose of J&J is more effective than 1 dose of mRNA vaccines. But if you're willing to go the 2-dose route, I think either one of those, from what we know now, are essentially equivocal. So I think Pfizer or Moderna, either one would be reasonable for you.
So this is an anecdotal illustration, Patrick, just from my life, but I had COVID the first week of July a year ago. So it's been like 14 months or so, 13, 14 months since I had COVID. And I gave blood 6 weeks later, and I had no antibodies in my blood at 6 weeks after I had COVID. I know that they say that typically they last